It is Book Review Sunday, and today's theme is nonfiction with an emphasis in history. The two books I will be reviewing today are The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander and The Woman They Could Not Silence by Kate Moore. Let's start with The New Jim Crow. So I want to start by sharing how I came across this book and why I chose to read it in the first place. So I am a U.S. history teacher during the school year. That's my day job. And the other teachers in my school, we were organizing and improving certain units as the school year was coming up. And we had a lesson on mass incarceration and then a separate lesson on the war on drugs. And in order to make room for other stuff that we needed to do, we decided to combine those two lessons because they're so closely related anyway. And it ended up falling on me to be the one to combine those two lessons. And a big part of both of those lessons is how it affects minority communities. So, unrelated, I'm at an art museum for a date night with my husband, and the museum has a section, well, they have several sections that I think are rotating exhibits, but one of the big upstairs section, that the entire upstairs is one large theme. That's one of their rotating exhibits, had just recently gone through an exhibit rotation. And the previous exhibit was, I think it was Black Lives Matter, or it might have just been race in general. I didn't actually see the exhibit, but there were lots of leftover stuff from the exhibit in the gift shop, and this book was one of them. And I saw the title and I thought, that looks like it might apply to my classroom, because high school history teachers, if it's not AP or another type of honors history class, teach from the industrial age, 1870, up to modern days, which this would fall into. So this is the 10th anniversary edition, is the one that I picked up. And even the 10th anniversary edition isn't that new, so I am quite behind the times on this. Yes, so copyright 2020. So I'm reading about 4 years after the 10th anniversary edition came out. And anyway, so it's been around for a while, but that's kind of my MO. I very rarely get to read a book right when it comes out because I don't know it exists until it starts to circulate. So anyway, and as I started to read what it was about, I was like, oh yeah, this is definitely right up my alley to these two lessons that I'm supposed to be combining. It's literally about how the war on drugs replaced Jim Crow laws, not just in the South, but the entire United States. And so I took me a while to read it because it was the school year and I had other projects going on, but I finished it in January. So it's been a couple months since I read it. So hopefully I can remember everything for my review. So I give The New Jim Crow 4 stars, and there's no information that I necessarily disagree with. It's not, I rate nonfiction differently than fiction. So you guys are used to me, if a book loses a star or two, it's because I wish that there was something different about the story. This isn't a story. This is all 100% fact. So I can't say, oh, I wish the facts were different. For me, with nonfiction, it's either did the author fully convince me of their claim, or was their style of writing my cup of tea? And so there's nothing factual that I disagree with in this book. I just learned that I'm not very good with stories. This isn't a story. I'm not very good with texts that are so much statistics and numbers, which is important to the topic. You know, we're talking about the prison system and the war on drugs. And so statistics are important because the numbers are what's going to tell us if this is even working or not. And of course, it's not working. Um, I just do better with short articles about this topic rather than a 300-page book. But that doesn't mean this book isn't important, and people who do like this kind of stuff would definitely benefit from reading it. So there's two main things going on here, at least what I saw as I read it. First is the timeline that this book goes through. So the author actually starts in pre slavery, or not pre slavery, but like pre Civil War. So she talks about caste systems and how the idea that different humans are at lower or higher ranks from other humans based on their socioeconomic status or their racial status or their gender or whatever other types of labels we put on ourselves and on other people. That an acceptance of a caste system is what led to an acceptance of slavery, and has what led to an acceptance of other unequal laws and societal norms. So she goes through caste systems, then she goes through slavery, and then we hit Jim Crow, which is where it applies to my classroom. And so Jim Crow laws, which I'm sure most of you know what they are, but anyone who needs a reminder or doesn't know, Jim Crow laws were the laws in the southern United States that made blacks unequal to whites. So your typical segregation, white and black restaurants, drinking fountains, buses, schools, etc. These laws also made voting restrictions, they had marital restrictions, they had education restrictions, career restrictions. Some states even went so far as to, say how much a white person could earn and how much a black person could earn. So any type of law that deliberately makes people unequal to each other is a Jim Crow law. And Jim Crow laws were made to replace slavery because slavery is now illegal, but the white lawmakers in the South and the white voters in the South wanted to make sure that the newly freed population was still below them. And so then they created these laws. And so these laws exist for the next 100-ish years. And people can argue that while the original laws have been repealed and replaced, there's still a lot of loopholes in today's laws, which I would agree with, especially when it comes to gerrymandering and changing the borders of schools and stuff like that. And so Jim Crow, for the most part, I'm not going to make a blatant claim here, is, fought and defeated throughout the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. And the war on drugs, according to this author, is going to replace the Jim Crow laws. And even before I read this book, just simply reading a sentence like that, I would have been like, yeah, I can see that with what I had taught in my classroom prior to reading this book. Um, just a short article on any of these numbers does show that we have percentage wise, so not numbers, percentage wise, more persons of color in prison than whites. Um, how the justice system works when it comes to drug use and drug selling. Um, Someone of a higher socioeconomic status is going to get a slap on the wrist and maybe get parole or probation, and someone of a lower socioeconomic status is going to actually spend time in jail or prison. So, but the author here takes this claim further than just these numbers, show that this is what's going on. She claims that this is intentional. So her claim in this book is that those who created the war on drugs created the drug laws with African Americans in mind. And the numbers in the book do back her up. And so we see this, she just has story after story after story in here of people who have spent their majority of their lives going in and out of prison because of harsh drug laws. And there are lots of different opinions in the 21st century on what the drug laws should be and how they should be handled. I'm not going to get into that. It's something I do encourage my students to get into. At the end of the lesson, I do have them, write a paragraph on whether they believe that the war on drugs has met its goal and if it has made any positive changes, and why or why not. And then I have them write another paragraph on if they were in charge, what would they do about drug use and the selling of drugs. So that's The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. And if this topic interests you, and if you love to read about numbers and statistics, then I think you will enjoy this book. So our second book to review is The Woman They Could Not Silence by Kate Moore. So this book, I was doing what was supposed to be a window shopping at Barnes & Noble, and I ended up coming away with 5 books. This is one of those books that I came away with. I was specifically looking for something else when I saw this book, and I thought, oh, that title is really interesting. And then I'm going to read the back to you because I want you to feel how I felt when I picked up this book. First of all, the title catches me right away. The Woman They Could Not Silence. That's powerful. And the subtitle, The Shocking Story of a Woman Who Dared to Fight Back. Okay, you've pulled me in with the title and the subtitle. What's this about? So I still don't quite know what this is. So, 1860, it was right before the Civil War. As the clash between the states rolls slowly to a boil, Elizabeth Packard, housewife and mother of 6, is facing her own battle. The enemy sits across the table and sleeps in the next room. Her husband, of 21 years, is plotting against her because he feels increasingly threatened by Elizabeth's intellect, independence, and unwillingness to stifle her own thoughts. So Theophilus makes a plan to put his wife back in her place. One summer morning, he has her committed to an insane asylum. The horrific conditions inside the Illinois State Hospital in Jacksonville, Illinois, are overseen by Dr. Andrew McFarland, a man who will prove to be even more dangerous to Elizabeth than her traitorous husband. But most disturbing is that Elizabeth is not the only sane woman confined to the institution. There are many rational women on her ward who tell the same story. They've been committed not because they need medical treatment, but to keep them in line. Conveniently labeled crazy, so their voices are ignored. No one is willing to fight for their freedom, and disenfranchised both by gender and the stigma of their supposed madness, they cannot possibly fight for themselves. But Elizabeth is about to discover that the merit of losing everything is that you have nothing to lose. So Kate Moore writes in a style that's called narrative nonfiction. So everything she writes is fact, it's true, but she writes it like you're reading a story, like you're reading historical fiction. So, oh man, this book had my blood boiling until like the last 50 pages. But it was amazing. Okay, so, whoa, let's get that. There we go. So I give The Woman They Could Not Silence 5 stars. So there are 4 main points to Elizabeth's true story. First is, and all of this is stuff I didn't know, but I very easily accepted as, yeah, that sounds about right for the time period. So first, what is considered insane in the 1800s, specifically for a woman? Because we're looking at women's rights here for this entire book. While she is going to kind of cover some male patients in the asylum, it's mostly women that Elizabeth meets because she lives on the women's side of the asylum. And they're the ones who are harmed the most, which, once again, for the time period is not surprising. So, what is considered insane for a woman in the 1800s? So, Elizabeth is middle class, probably upper middle class-ish. She is educated, and her husband is a preacher for their local church. And so she obviously needs to be educated in the Bible for sure. The preacher's wife can't, be unknowledgeable about religious matters. And so this is during a new kind of religious revival, Second Great Awakening. They're at the tail end of that kind of stuff, where these new religious ideas are floating around the United States. New churches are being created. People are converting to these new churches, or just simply changing from one church to the other as they find new interpretations of the Bible, new philosophies that match their personal ideologies. And so Elizabeth ends up going down this path. And, for most of her marriage, they have adult children at this point. For most of her marriage, her husband was kind of all right with her being educated and intellectual and vocal. But what Elizabeth doesn't know is that her husband is being pressured by the people who fund their church to start preaching certain ideologies with the upcoming Civil War. Obviously, they don't know a war is going to happen, but the country is on pins and needles with the whole abolitionist argument, and the people who are funding Theophilus's church are anti-abolitionists, and so that's how they want him to interpret the Bible. And Elizabeth is pro-abolitionist and pro-women's rights. So her having different religious opinions from her husband, the fact that she vocalizes them, and the fact that when he tells her to shut up, she doesn't, deems her insane. And so in order to put her in the asylum, Theophilus needs to have 2 doctors sign a certificate that states that Elizabeth is insane. So one doctor actually visits Elizabeth and agrees with Theophilus because, these are the good old boys. And the second doctor doesn't even visit with her. He just reads Theophilus's letter, goes, "Oh yeah, your wife sounds insane," checks it off. He has two certificates, and he carts Elizabeth off to the Jacksonville Asylum in Illinois. The next interesting aspect of insanity during this time is the doctor who is over her once she's in the asylum. Because the asylum, for the most part, is not there to house people indefinitely. It's to treat them to make them sane again, or sane enough that they can go back into society. And so, because she's being placed there for thinking differently from her husband and disobeying her husband, her sanity, or earning her sanity back, is going to be linked to accepting her husband's position over her. Now, Elizabeth is justifiably furious with Theophilus for putting her in an asylum when she knows that she is not insane. And so all of her sessions with the doctor are her complaining about her husband and saying how much she hates him and how stupid he is and how he's just scared because he knows she's smart and, stuff like that. Stuff that a 21st century person reading this book is going to agree with. But Dr. McFarland does not, and he believes, at least he writes, we don't know what he actually believes, because as we dive deeper into him, he's clearly a corrupt person and wants as many patients as possible for monetary reasons. Dr. McFarland claims that Elizabeth is more insane than originally thought because she hates her husband and can't be swayed to love him again. Oh, anyway, can you see why my blood boiled the whole time I was reading this book? So, this leads into a next aspect of this book that is what keeps Elizabeth there is, and I knew that men like owned their wives and their daughters back then, but I didn't realize it was as deep as Elizabeth's story shows. So her friends who don't think she's insane try to get her a court date because they go digging into the law and they say someone can't be put into the asylum against their will without a jury conviction of insanity. Well, the other side digs into the law and says, yes, that would be true if Elizabeth were a man. But because she's a woman, if her husband wishes it, she's his property. So there you go. Also, during this whole issue, Elizabeth has the option to divorce Theophilus, to petition him for divorce. He's not asking to divorce her. And she declines for her entire life for one very important reason. If she divorces him, she loses her kids. For the very rare divorce that happened back then, the kids were automatically given to the husband, and even visitation rights were rarely given to the mom. And so if a woman chose to, and moms get a lot of judgment in any era of time for how they're raising their kids and what love is supposed to look like and what motherhood is supposed to look like. And so learning that made me realize that, the women who did go through with divorce back then, if they did have children, things must have been so bad for their emotional and physical safety that they were willing to give that up. And that says a lot. Next, we spend the majority of the book on the treatment of patients in asylums. And this was something I already had a basic understanding of, that there was a lot of physical abuse that was either believed or twisted into claiming that this was, for their treatment. So when Elizabeth first enters the asylum, she's placed in the best ward with other women from high socioeconomic standing. And so she gets a private room. She has writing materials. She has her trunk with her clothes, and she has her Bible. She has access to the newspaper. She's basically um, living as a guest for the most part. She gets to go on walks on the grounds and stuff like that. And as she passes other wards, the patients, kind of cry out to her and beg her for help. And she's like that. At first, she ignores them because she's like, oh, those ones are the truly insane ones. And then she does some digging and she learns that um, people are being abused by the doctor and by the employees. And so she approaches McFarland about this, and he tells her to leave it be, and she won't leave it be. So then he punishes her by putting her in a ward um, with way less amenities. So she's no longer in a private room. She lost all of her writing materials. She lost her Bible. She lost her clothes, um, everything, and she is treated like a truly insane person. And while the staff doesn't ever physically abuse her, McFarland orders the staff to place her in close proximity to patients who are violent. And so then she gets her hair pulled, she gets punched, she cutlery is thrown at her during meal times from patients who are violent. And during this time, the abuse of the patients even escalates. So she witnesses a new treatment where they fill a bath with water and shove the patients underneath it until they can't hold their breath any longer, and they pull them back up just in enough time before they lose consciousness or even die. And patients get shackled, they get boxes put over their heads. Just awful, awful abuse, all in the name of treatment. And so during this time, people are sneak Elizabeth writing materials, so she is able to write, and then she hides it. And so she says at one point in her asylum journal that people come in here sane and they leave insane. How, she says, of course, as they go through these abuses that's being passed off as medical treatment, of course it's going to play on your psychological welfare and you eventually will become insane. You're getting hit, you're getting kicked, you're getting drowned, um, solitary confinement. It's a prison, it's not a medical facility. And so she refuses to obey. Even when she's given this punishment of being in this worst ward, she continues to try to fight for her release and the release of the other sane patients. And she ends up in front of the board of trustees, and she has this written speech prepared, and she wins their hearts, and her release is supposed to happen. But then McFarland blocks it, her husband blocks it, and over time, McFarland comes to the conclusion that it's much better to release her because she can do less damage away from the asylum than what she's currently doing inside the asylum. So once Elizabeth is released, she, of course, is not just going to go back to her regular life, and she starts to lobby the government for a change in the law, particularly in allowing women a trial of insanity before just simply being placed there. And so to start that, she gets put on trial in a court of law. And it's an amazing trial, you guys. Oh my gosh. It was great. You need to read it. So Elizabeth ends up winning, and so she is declared sane, and so her husband cannot place her in an insane asylum ever again, which he was working on doing behind her back. He had found her a spot in a different asylum, and that asylum's doctor promised Theophilus, I will admit her for life. She will never leave my building. So, since Theophilus loses the court case, the only thing that this court case did was declare Elizabeth sane and protecting her from being put in an asylum. That's all it changes. She's still married to Theophilus. He still has legal ownership of her. He still has legal ownership of their children. So he packs up, and it's only viable in the state of Illinois. So Elizabeth has to stay in Illinois in order to remain safe. Theophilus takes their children and moves to Massachusetts. And he does that to spite her. And so she has to get the laws changed in Massachusetts before she can follow him there. So Elizabeth is going to spend the next several years trying to get the laws changed across the entire country, from state to state. And so she's going to do this by publishing several texts. So she publishes a pamphlet about asylums and women's rights. She publishes a book about her time in the asylum, along with the stories of other patients. And then she publishes a book all about Dr. McFarland and what a terrible and corrupt person he is. And this is going to lead to an investigation and drastic changes, not in Illinois, but in other parts of the United States, for the rights of asylum patients. And Elizabeth is going to, for the most part, get her family back. Her children all eventually return to her, and she does spend her final days with her children. They all live close as a family. Even Theophilus moves nearby, but they never reconcile as a couple, which is understandable. I think that the damage was done the minute he stuck her in an asylum. There was no going back. There was no forgiveness for that. But Elizabeth is a powerful woman in U.S. history. And at least when I do a quick Google search, she's not on any list. Like if you do most influential women in America, she's not on any list. Even a list of 125 women, she's not on that list. And she needs to be. You need to know who she is, because she did a lot for women's rights when it came to their ownership of their, at least for mental health, the ownership of their bodies in that aspect. And so, anyway, I can't even think of the best way to end this, just to tell you that she's amazing and you need to know her name. So, if you like biographies, you like women's history, you need to read this. The Woman They Could Not Silence by Kate Moore. So that's what we have for today. If you've read either of these books and you'd like to share your thoughts in the comments, please do so. If you have any biographies, autobiographies, memoirs you've read that you would like to recommend, please also do that in the comments. And click subscribe so that you can know when the next video is out. And I will see you next Sunday.